So there's something I've never talked about on this channel, which is essential for good writing. And longtime viewers are probably like, there's something you haven't talked about on this channel yet. And you know, I have made hundreds of videos covering plot and characters and theme and sentences and pretty much everything you can imagine. But there is one thing that I've never really talked about. And that's what we're covering today in the video. But it's not just me, it's almost everyone who covers fiction never talks about this because it's really difficult to teach and it's really difficult to talk about. So this might be a huge mistake and it might be my worst video of all time, but I'm going to give a stab at it. And what I'm going to try to cover is what I call the squishy elements of fiction. Squishy elements are stuff like interestingness and originality and depth of vision. The type of stuff that it's, I don't know, you can't find in a textbook most of the time. You can't read like a writing craft book and figure out like, now I know how to be original. So let's see if your book has at least 7 of these kind of abstract qualities. The first thing we're going to look at is something called charm. Now, when I say charm, you might think, oh, he's talking about humor. I think charm includes humor, but it's not limited to humor. For instance, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's so playful and it just draws you in with this light-hearted tone. That's a certain element of charm, I think. Or think about Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. The amount of jokes that these cowboys crack, it just keeps the novel feeling very welcoming. Sometimes charm is a little bit like enchantment, like Eric Morgenstern's The Night Circus. There's these black and white tents, there's a clock, there's a smell of wood smoke in the air. I mean, it's just like very inviting. Or if you look at Anne of Green Gables, sometimes charm is just a kind of optimistic winsomeness. And you know, you read the book and you just feel better afterwards. Or think about Theo of Golden by Alan Levy. How in this case, the charm manifests itself as just being very heartwarming. So I have 3 tips about how to add more charm to your book. One is that you need to realize that conflict isn't the only storytelling device out there. And yes, I know, every writing teacher out there is like, add more conflict to your story. Is a scene not working? Add more conflict. But I think that sort of advice doesn't leave any room for no conflict scenes where you have the opportunity to have a charming scene. The second thing I'd like to add is that you can't add charm in revision. This is something that's sort of baked into the sentences and the very like heart of your book. It's not something you sort of layer in afterwards. It's like a general disposition that you're writing with. And then 3, if you want more charm in your novel, don't be afraid to love something. Baseball or chocolate or circuses. I think of a book like Legends and Lattes, and the whole appeal of that book is that you're combining coffee with fantasy world. And people are like, I'm down with it. So let's move now to a second sort of abstract, squishy idea about fiction. And this is interestingness. So what makes a book interesting and what makes a book not interesting? Here's the thing, beta readers and workshop leaders and your mother, like none of them will ever tell you that your book is not interesting, right? They might say, oh, I didn't like this character, or, you know, this chapter, it didn't work for me, but they never say like, it's not interesting. But some of the time, and you've read some of these books, right? The problem is, it's not interesting. Now, there are 2 possible pitfalls here. One would be, is it an interesting concept? It might be, it might not be. And the second thing is, do you have an interesting execution of that concept? There's a book that's making the rounds right now called Yesteryear by Carl Claire Burke. And in this novel, there's a social media influencer who like, you know, has this farm life and she's a trad wife and she's projecting this image of, you know, living that life and how sexy and amazing it is. And then suddenly she wakes up in the 1850s and all those things that she was sort of play acting at, now she has to do for real. No electricity, no running water, no gasp, internet. Now, that is an interesting concept, and that's why Anne Hathaway immediately snapped up the film rights. But let's say you feel really confident about your concept. You're like, listen, John, my concept is super interesting. Everyone I tell it to is immediately like, I would totally read that. Okay, well then you need to work on the interestingness of the execution. And this is basically in every single scene that you write, how much energy and fun is there in it? Like, what sort of pleasures are you bringing to the page? When people read that fun thing, are they entertained on a paragraph to paragraph and a sentence to sentence level? Now, if you're worried that your execution isn't as strong as it could be, the fastest route to make it more interesting is simply to look over the whole book or whatever you have written so far and cut the least interesting section, right? It doesn't matter whether you think there's crucial information in there or not, you will find a way to, you know, put it in a different scene. If you go through and keep on cutting all the weakest parts, you're going to be left with a stronger and more interesting book. It's a little bit like Michelangelo when he carved David. They asked him how he did it, and he's like, I just cut away everything that wasn't the statue. Yeah, that's what you should do for your book. Okay, third kind of abstract, squishy thing that we're going to talk about today is originality. I remember reading someone's work, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and it was simply too close to Harry Potter. There was a magic school, the kid was an orphan, there was a mentor character, there was, of course, lots of magic, and I'm like, this just feels like a ripoff. And I've also read an imitation of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Red Sky and Morning by Paul Lynch. I mean, he has a very similar villain. He has very similar sentences, very similar like darkness to it. I'm like, okay, I feel like I've read this before. Like, you're not writing an original book, you're just sort of copying someone else. Listen, without originality, your book is always going to be playing second fiddle to the original. You're always going to be a copy, and you're never going to be the primary source. But I will say that you can't have too much originality as well. I'm thinking about some sort of, experimental authors out there. And I've read Herta Mueller and W.G. Sebald and William Gaddis. And you know what? I mean, if that's what you really want to write, go for it. But I feel like they are inaccessible to 99.9% of the populace. What you actually want to find is some sort of middle ground of originality. And I think someone who does this really well is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So this is sci-fi, but it's a subgenre of sci-fi where evolutionary processes are sort of sped up. And so we get basically evolved spiders who are just as intelligent and socially complex as humans. Now, have other writers done speculative evolution sci-fi? Yeah, right? It's an existing genre. He didn't make up the genre himself, but he stepped into it, and then he still came up with something very, very original inside that framework. Now, the fourth abstract / squishy thing that you should be paying attention to is connection with the world. How does your novel address the zeitgeist, the feeling in the air of this modern era, the things that we're debating on the streets, the things that are impacting our lives right now? I think back to a novel like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This was a landmark novel that investigated the unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry of Chicago, and it made such a huge impact that it launched the start of the FDA. Yeah, that FDA exists because of this novel. Or think about a topic like immigration. On one side of the spectrum, you have something like American Dirt by Janine Cummins, which is humanizing the immigrant and showing their plight of trying to immigrate to the US. And then on the complete other side of the spectrum, you have something like Camp of the Saints by Jean Raspail. This is a book which shows a huge wave of Indian immigration coming to France and the way that all of those immigrants at once destroys the country. So he's arguing very much against immigration and really dehumanizes the immigrant. Think about something like social media, right? Part of the reason that Hunger Games was such a huge success was that it really mimics the feeling of posting to social media, where you're trying to get attention, you're trying to receive favors from people, and you are on screen all day long, like there are constantly cameras being pointed at you. Or think of Dave Eggers' The Circle, which is basically a satire of this Facebook-like company that argues no one should have any privacy ever, and he's like, no, we need privacy, trust me. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're like, I don't want my book to follow a trend, And I'm not saying that you have to be trendy. I'm saying that if you grapple with the topic that is currently out there in the world, it just goes a long way to make people feel interested in reading your book. And they're like, yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I've been hearing a lot about that. And so they want to pick up your book and read it. Now, this fifth point is actually the one that I think is hardest to explain, but I also think if you can master it, it will pay the biggest dividends for your book. And it is number 5. Depth of vision. Depth of vision is how far down the writer sees. Do you have this coherent, penetrating way of seeing people, society, morality, consciousness? Now, you might think like, isn't that just originality? And I would say no. Originality is comparing your book to other books that currently exist, right? While depth of vision is more about comparing your book to the world. Like, how does your book speak into the world, and how deep and gripping is it? And here's the funny thing. I do think depth of vision can exist without originality. And I'll prove it to you. Look at an author like Alice Munro, all of her books. She's not doing anything especially radical. She's not doing anything especially seismic. She's telling fairly traditional stories. But I think everyone would argue that there is a very deep depth of vision in terms of understanding human psychology and looking into the human condition. And I'd also say an author like Ayn Rand has a depth of vision, right? She came up with a whole philosophy that undergirds her books. Now, whether you like or dislike Ayn Rand is sort of beside the point. The point is, like, her books are definitely advocating for a very specific vision of the world, and it's a fairly complex vision. So now it's time for you to determine what the depth of vision is for you in your book. I would ask yourself this: does my book contain a particular view of the world? And it needs to be a view that's different from the one that everyone else in your state or country share, right? If it's just the default view of morality or society shared by, I don't know, 90% of the people living around you, then I would say that your book probably doesn't have depth of vision. You're just sort of mimicking all the ideas that are already out there. All right, this next point is a lot of fun. I think you will enjoy it. It is number 6, energy. Let me ask you this. Is your writing energetic? I mean, on a sentence to sentence level. Is it like pulsing with vitality? Now, when this topic of energy comes up, I always think back to Joyce Carol Oates, who talked about Jonathan Safran Foer praising his writing when he was only an undergrad, being like, this kid's writing is so energetic. It has so much energy in it. And lo and behold, this was a couple years before he came out with his first book, which was this wild, crazy runaway success. And his second book as well, which was a success, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which is about a kid who loses his father in 9/11. And let's look at the first paragraph of this so you can just see what I'm talking about when I talk about energy. So what I want you to do is just pause the video for a second and try reading this out loud. I think you will find as you read it out loud, you're like, whoa, this has like energy to spare. It is like tap dancing upon the page. Now, how does he accomplish this high energy? One, he starts sort of midstream. He actually wrote about 9 pages before this, and then as he kept reading over it, he's like, I'm gonna cut all that and start right here. What about a tea kettle? I also think he gets energy by having these longer sentences that kind of tumble over each other in their excitement. And lastly, I think he creates some energy by using anaphora, which is a phrase that starts with the very same word multiple times in a row. So look at which is in Versailles, which is outside Paris, which is in France. That sort of repetition creates energy as well. Now, some of you are saying like, John, listen, I don't want to write like that. Do I have to be energetic to be a good writer? And I will say, unlike most of the other things in this abstract list, you don't have to have high energy. I think you can have like a controlled or measured energy as well. And you're just appealing to a different sort of reader out there. When I think about a great book with very low key energy, I think of John Williams Stoner. Check out this paragraph. It's the opening paragraph of that book. Now, this is about a professor's quiet academic life. So it'd honestly be a disservice to the topic of what's happening in the book if he tried to have this high octane writing. Read this out loud to yourself. It's very low key. It's very unremarkable. There's an accumulation of details, and it's just this small life which is very carefully observed. I think the trick for you is to figure out, what is your energy on the page? What is your natural voice? And maybe think about like how you speak and interact with other people in the real world, right? Are you more of like a bouncy, energetic person? Then that should come through on the page. On the other hand, if you're much more of a quiet or reserved person, then try to weave that sort of magic on the page. All right, and our last point, which I say for last because I do think is most important, is number 7, authority. Do you have authority as a writer? And can your readers sense that authority right off the bat? Now, if you're getting rejected from traditional publishing, no agent would ever be like, you know what? You're just not authoritative on the page. They're not going to say that, but half of the time it really is that your prose didn't have enough authority to convince them that you were the right person to tell this story. Look, I spent 10 years as a college professor and I read tens of thousands of student essays, and I could usually tell within 3 sentences whether they had plagiarized it, because the pros had a certain level of authority and command that I knew they didn't possess. And the same thing holds true of fiction writing. I can read 3 sentences, and already, because of the way those 3 sentences connect with one another, the variety between them, the word choice in them, I can already tell whether the author has enough authority for me to want to go on this journey with them. And I know you're like, 3 sentences? Are you serious right now? And I'm like, yeah, I'm really serious. Sometimes it's 1 sentence. Sometimes it's the very first sentence. So what can you do if you're not sure whether you have authority, or you just think, I want to get more authority in my prose? One, I think work on decisiveness at the sentence level. Cut out all those maybes and a bit and almost and perhaps, and condense your sentence down to the essential bits. I also think there's a certain amount of sure-footedness that you want to work on as a sentence writer, not making wonky word choices or allowing a sentence to run on for far too long. And honestly, check out my course, How to Write a Splendid Sentence. That really takes you through a whole bunch of steps that teach you what to look for in a sentence, how to make sure you're writing a solid, authoritative sentence. But one more thing about authority, it doesn't just come from the sentences themselves, it also comes from the knowledge of the author. So Hilary Mantel really convinces you that she knows Tudor England on the inside and out when you read her historical novels. And Andy Weir really convinces you that he knows the biology and how it would work on Mars. And a good romance writer like Emily Henry really commands trust because she knows human psychology and knows how 2 people will connect together. Now, a lot of this stuff can be weak on the first draft, so don't put that pressure on yourself that it has to be perfect. Just dwell with the book for a while and look for the weak spots and try to shore those up so that when it does go to print and you release it to people, people are like, this person knows what they're talking about. Hey, if that sentence course sounded interesting to you, I have 10 more courses that you should check out in Bookfox Academy. I'll put the link to that in the description below so you can click and see if you want to watch more than 230 videos with me talking about every single aspect of fiction. And thank you for thinking deeply about these abstract, squishy notions of your fiction. I know it's tough to pin down, but I think if you can concentrate on these, your book will be stronger for it.